Hello, Professor Weber. Welcome to this episode of Today on Wall Street. We're so great to have you here. Professor Weber, you are an author of the new book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate, which documents this fascinating period of time in China's recent history, the 1980s, when you sort of describe this debate between two camps, the so-called package reformers who support wholesale price liberalization versus people who prefer a more gradual approach in order to keep inflation in check. I thought it was a fascinating book. But before we get into the details of the book, I wonder if you can introduce yourself to our audience a little bit. What got you interested in studying China's economy?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the show. This is really a great opportunity, and I'm very keen to be here. Thank you so much. So my name is Isabella Weber. I'm an assistant professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I first got interested in all these questions when I was an undergraduate exchange student in Beijing, where as a major in politics and economics, I was taking courses in economics at Beida. And I was struck by the fact that the students there were studying from the same kind of textbooks that I knew from back home, from Berlin, which were all American authored, not necessarily American authored, but textbooks authored by American professors, which kind of struck me as surprising, since obviously there are so many big differences between the Chinese, German, and American economy. So how can it be that we are all studying the exact same kind of economics? So I started to become interested in the role of economics in China's reform process and the role of economists in shaping China's path over the decades. So this is really the starting point. And then I realized that to understand the path of China's reforms, I really had to go back to the origins of reform in the first decade. That is to go back to the first years right after 1978 and the beginning of reform and opening.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for that introduction. Next, I wanted to turn to your book. So, as I mentioned in the intro, your book is called How China Escaped Shock Therapy. So that's kind of an interesting title. I wonder if you can unpack the title for our audience a little bit. What is shock therapy?
Yeah, thank you. So basically, by including shock therapy in the title, I'm linking China's reform debate to the bigger debates that were happening around economic reform globally at the time in the 1980s, both in developing countries as well as a couple of years later, in fact, in other formerly state socialist countries such as in Eastern Europe and Russia. So broadly speaking, there were different paradigms of how to go about moving towards more markets or a greater role for the market in the economy. One idea was that you had to get rid of the core of the planned economy as quickly as possible in order to make space for the market to take a stronghold in the key parts of the economic system to begin with. And the other idea was the one that ultimately prevailed in China, that is a more gradualist, experimentalist approach, where basically you start from the parts of the system that can be changed without, in the first instance, changing the core of the system, and then unleash a new dynamic. And as a result of that, gradually reform. So this latter path is not less radical in its outcome, I think, but it has a very different kind of approach and a very different kind of thinking about the role of markets in relation to the state and the role of the government in guiding the market reform process.
So in addition to shock therapy, your book also provides a fascinating account of the kind of intellectual and political debate in the 80s when China was transitioning its economic model. I think it came as a little bit of a surprise to me. Lots of people I used to think as hardliners actually are not people who argue to stay in status quo. They actually argue for change, but the kind of change they envision is different from the other camps. I wonder if you can give us a fuller picture of the various players in this debate. What are the various schools of thoughts, and which political factions are the main proponents for each, so to speak?
Yeah, so a lot of our record of the early reform years has been framed in terms of market reformers versus conservatives. So it seems like there's one homogeneous camp of people who want to marketize, and then there's a homogeneous camp of people who want to basically stay with the planned economy. What I'm doing in the book is to break up this basic confrontation into more nuance by showing that one of the most fiercely debated questions in the 1980s was in many ways not whether or not to reform, that is not whether or not to start introducing market mechanisms as part of economic governance, but rather the question of how to go about this. So people like Chen Yun or even Deng Liqun in the very early years of reform were actually crucial in setting the stage towards market reforms, even though towards the late 1980s, they thought things were going too far. On the other hand, someone like Zhao Ziyang, who is generally portrayed as one of the most liberal reformers of the 1980s, turns out to have been absolutely essential in facilitating the reforms of the 1980s in the economic rearm. At the same time, however, while he has been toying with the idea of pursuing more wholesale reform, and in fact, in 1986, Zhao Ziyang took initiative for the so-called program office, which would have entailed a pretty radical, pretty comprehensive price, tax, and wage reform that would have come close to the idea of a big bang, that would have come close to cutting the chains of command and order at the core of the industrial planned economy in the first place. However, Zhao Ziyang then abstains from that for complex historical reasons that I'm explaining in detail in the book. And then towards the end of the 80s actually is, I think, one of the people who wants to stick with the dual track reform system. So once we get into the nitty-gritty details of this history, we find that most of these characters are really quite complex and that their position is also changing over time, while one of the most contested questions is really the method of introducing markets into China's economy, not simply with the goal of marketization, but always with an eye to development and an improvement of the material conditions and the position of China's economy in the world economy.
I wonder if you can briefly introduce to us sort of the economic rationales behind each camp of thinking. Why do they think their way of approaching reform is the best or is superior than what the other camps are proposing?
Yeah, so I think that for the gradualist experimentalist approach that is really encapsulated in the dual track price system, there are, broadly speaking, two key sources of inspiration. One is the experience of economic warfare during the Chinese Civil War of the 1940s and also the years immediately after the revolution, where the communists really had to lay the foundation economically for their struggle for revolution. And in doing that, they used market mechanisms as a tool in order to reintegrate parts of the economy that under the pressures of the war had been really disintegrated and where people had withdrawn from the greater division of labor across regions and between sectors. So this is one important source of inspiration. And in fact, as I point out in the book, in some of the dialogues between the World Bank and some senior Chinese policymakers and economists such as Xu Muqiao, at some point, one of the World Bank officials notes in his notebook that that he's puzzled. Why do the Chinese answer to every question about reform that they have to go back to the techniques of the liberation period? So there is a very clear reference to this experience on the part of the older generation economic officials or economic thinkers, economic policymakers. The second important source of inspiration, I think, and this is in fact linked to this first source, is the experience of agricultural reform. So in the late 1970s, there are important steps that are being taken towards readjusting the relationship between the urban industrial and the rural agricultural economy. During the Mao period, the transfers from the rural economy into the urban economy were very critical in financing the buildup of basic industries, which in fact was important, I think, in laying the foundations also for the reform success. Nevertheless, in the late 1970s, it becomes clear that this kind of model seems to have reached its limits. So there is an attempt to redefine the relationship between the urban and industrial economy and the rural agricultural economy, which starts by adjusting the relative prices of agricultural goods in relation to industrial goods, and then moves into the so-called household responsibility system, where in the first instance, some of these experiments with household responsibility are really spontaneously bottom up, but at the same time, they are enabled by a recognition of the central leadership that it may not be possible to control the whole agricultural economy from in the fashion of central planning, and that it might be better to let, in particular, those parts of the agricultural economy that had been very poor and that were unable to provide large surpluses or any surpluses at all to the national grain system, do whatever they wanted to do.
Right.
So in that sense, they were considered as non-essential to the working of the national grain system, since they were not net providers of grain surpluses. Right. So under the household responsibility system, as is probably well known to this audience, households took over the responsibility for fulfilling their share in the quota that used to be with the production teams within the people's communes. And they are basically delivering their share of the quota at a planned price, while after delivering that share of the quota, they can produce whatever they want for the market at a market price. So as a result of this, you get a dual track system where the same producers are catering both for the plan and for the market, which means that in the first instance, as this system is being transferred from the poorest rural communities that were not able to produce surpluses into communities that were actually producing surpluses. This meant that in the first instance, the national grain system was kept going, right? Because the households still had a commitment to deliver their share of the quota, while at the same time, beyond this beyond keeping the national grain system going, a market dynamic was emerging, if you want so, at the margins of the initial system. So this basic logic of starting from the non-essential and then unleashing a new dynamic, which is a new market dynamic, and having a duality of plan and market existing at the same time, this same logic then eventually becomes transferred into the urban industrial economy. And if you think about it, this is happening naturally, quote unquote, naturally, in the sense that once you have people in the rural economy who are producing for the market and are generating a market income, then they also want to buy stuff with that income, right? They might want to buy some tools to improve the production of whatever they have started to pursue as sideline production. They might also want to buy some consumer goods and so on, right? So as a result of the dual track system in the rural economy, you get some sort of a pull towards a dual track system also in the urban industrial sphere. But then the question becomes, is this something that is desirable? Is this a good thing? Should this be national policy? Should this dynamic be harvested or harnessed? Should it maybe even be encouraged, or should it be suppressed? And there's one camp of people, which is basically an alliance of older generation economic leaders and younger generation intellectuals who had spent their youth as sent down youth in the countryside during the Cultural Revolution, and who had played an important role in the agricultural reforms, who are arguing that that using this dual track kind of logic also in the urban industrial economy would be the way forward for China, since it would allow China to unleash a market dynamic while at the same time ensuring that the industrial backbone, the industrial core of the economy could remain intact and could be gradually transformed rather than to risk for it to collapse. On the other hand, there is a build-up for this logic of package reform, as you rightly pointed out in your introduction, where basically the idea is that in order for China to move forward and to advance economically, China would need a more rational economic system. Now, in order for China to have a rational economic system, it would have to have one coherent economic coordinating mechanism. It had turned out that the planned economy was not able to present such a coherent, rational economic coordinating mechanism. So therefore, China should move towards being a market economy. Now, in order to be a market economy, from that perspective, the most important thing would be to have clear price signals. Because if you don't have the right price signals, then basically all the market agents are just in a situation of complete chaos, so that whatever market mechanisms you have are not going to produce any kind of desirable outcomes. But in fact, the situation might be even more messy than under the planned economy. So they were basically suggesting that having this dual track price system would create enormous friction within the system, because suddenly you had planned prices and you had market prices, and you did no longer have any kind of a coherent planned economy from that perspective, while the market, as being the second track kind of element, also had no chance of being a rational or reliable coordinating mechanism. So the idea was that in this context, it would be important to think about reform as creating a whole new economic system, deciding what that target system should be, and then defining clear steps that should be as fast as possible to move from the initial situation to this target system. And since prices were thought of as this absolutely essential signals, it was suggested that liberalizing all prices pretty much overnight would be a crucial first step towards the success of market reforms. Now, these kind of ideas are broadly speaking rooted in what we call neoclassical economics, and were introduced to China by a whole range of different kinds of actors. And I wouldn't say it is simply a foreign importation. I would say that these ideas were adapted to the Chinese context, but they were very much developed in dialogue with foreign counterparts. And there was an interesting mix of people like Bruce and Ottokar Schick. Ottokar Schick was the architect of the economic reforms of the Prague Spring, and by that time, in the early 80s, when he was in China, he in fact was already exiled in St. Gallen in Switzerland. And Bruce, who used to be involved with the price reforms in in Poland was exiled in Oxford in England. And there was a whole range of other emigre Eastern European reform economists who most of them had been exiled, or at least were some kind of mediators who were in close exchange with the Western economics community. These people were brought in by the World Bank, since the World Bank thought that, rightly so, that these Eastern European economists were excellent neoclassical economists, and they also understood the language and the challenges of socialism, so that they were really the perfect ambassadors for neoclassical economics in China, understanding the challenges of the old system while speaking the language of what was then international mainstream economics. But there were also people like Milton Friedman, who visited China already early on, who of course is considered the figurehead of global neoliberalism, and who certainly struck a much more radical tone than the Eastern European reformers. But they basically agreed that China was in need of a very radical price reform, and that this was the most urgent first step that had to be taken in order to move towards a more market-based economy.
I see. Fascinating. Thank you so much for all the fascinating details in that answer. As we briefly iterated over email, there was this famed photo of Zhao Ziyang and Milton Friedman, which has captured the imagination of many people of what really happened. But thank you for giving us a context of that conversation and letting us know, how those foreign economists played a role in the debate in China in the 1980s. I wanted to talk a little bit about the consequences of economic reforms, especially in the lead up to the Tiananmen Square protest in 1989. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the success versus failure of the economic reforms in the 80s and how that factored into the protest and crackdown in 1989.
Yeah, first of all, of course, the agricultural reforms were initially in the first years an overwhelming success that unleashed a whole new dynamic, and that proceeded as quickly as pretty much no one really, according to the interviews that I have conducted, no one at the time really was foreseeing that it would be going, that the change would be that fast. And also that the outcomes would be so astonishing, but also how quickly these dual track reforms that, as I've just argued in my previous answer, to some extent are gradualist, but at the same time are quite radical, because as the responsibility moved from the communes to the households, it actually did lead to the dismantling of the communes. And the communes, of course, had been the main institution of the agricultural economy and agricultural life and rural life really in China in the Mao period. That being said, the dual track reforms in the urban industrial economy were also quite successful, however, turned out to be more complex and challenging in some ways than the rapid success of the initial years of the agricultural reforms might have suggested. So one of the challenges was that first of all, different parts of the system had different abilities to engage in dual track system. Depending on what kind of factor you were, you might be in a position of benefiting largely, whereas some other units might not be benefiting as much, which was not necessarily a result of your economic entrepreneurship or diligence or anything like that, but which was simply a result of initial conditions, right? So as such, the dual track system did unleash an extraordinary dynamic towards economic expansion and rebuilding of the Chinese economy, but at the same time also created new inequalities within the urban industrial system and also across all strata, all sorts of strata of society. Furthermore, as the leaders of companies were now catering to two prices, there was a big incentive towards corruption, since if you were able to channel some resources out of the plan where prices were generally lower and into the market track, you could reap a pretty big benefit. So on the one hand, this could unleash a positive dynamic, since if you were doing this by increasing efficiency of production in the plan track in order to have capacity to also produce for the market, then this unleashes an enormous growth dynamic, right? At the same time, if officials simply channeled resources that were meant for the plan into the market, then this could, of course, create a big problem for the plan and could create a problem of corruption. So that these challenges were emerging, and as the price liberalizations were proceeding from less essential to more and more important goods, there was also already in the late 1980s a certain upward pressure on prices, so that people who had been accustomed to enormously stable prices in the Mao period and enormously stable incomes at the same time, especially for the urban population. Low, of course. I'm not saying there was no poverty. Of course, there was severe poverty, but the prices were basically for the period before the reform pretty much frozen. So there was no accustomed, people weren't accustomed with price swings. So as this dynamic was also unfolding, this whole mixture kind of created a new anxiety around reforms. So and at the same time, some of these first people like Chen Yun, who had taken initiative towards reform and were critical in setting the stage for reform in the late 70s and the 80s, were actually also thinking that possibly reform was going too far, right? So in this whole context, even though reform is unleashing this new dynamic, is unleashing a growth dynamic, these challenges become more and more salient, and you get into this kind of deadlock situation in 1988. So in this situation, I believe Deng Xiaoping is really the one who takes initiative and suggests that it would be good for China to try to, as he says, crush through the gate of price reform, which would be one of the big roadblocks in China's progress in reform, and starts a campaign talking to foreign delegations, including a delegation from North Korea, ironically, suggesting that China would have to be brave and would have to take risks, and that there's the tale of Lord Guang, who would have slashed all generals that came in his way into half, suggesting that to win, one had to face the challenges heads on, and that it would be better for China to endure short-term pain rather than to be caught up in long-term difficulties, and therefore a radical step in price reform would be necessary. Now, this is basically happening in a context of already, as I mentioned, still rather mild, but still inflationary tendency, where all the people who were arguing for radical price reform were actually suggesting that you would have to have, in the first instance, macroeconomic restraint to stabilize the economy and then liberalize. So in that sense, this whole initiative of the summer of '88 is not really in line with either of the camps of reform economists, since the side that would have argued for such a radical step thought that the conditions weren't ripe, whereas the other side thought that this step should not be taken in the first place, right? So as Deng Xiaoping takes this initiative, then there's an official announcement that comprehensive price reform will follow. And in this already heated environment, people react to this with bank runs and panic buying. There's this famous anecdote of people in Kunming buying up air conditioners, which, as we all know, Kunming is the city of spring. So clearly people are not buying air conditioners because it's too hot, but because they think it's better to have an air conditioner than to have cash in the bank account or in their drawer. So there's this whole meltdown, which then results in a turnaround, a turn away from this initiative towards price reform, and also an overall restraint on more economic reform. And I think that this whole spiraling out of control of the situation and then this backlash against reform that follows in late 1988 is an important tapestry to the kind of tension that then unloads in 1989.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for giving us that background information. So speaking of sort of the far-reaching impact of reforms as we saw, across the world, it's actually quite interesting, how many famous protests, starting from the French Revolution to more recent Arab Springs and protests in France, is actually linked with economic situations, especially inflation and corruption. So that really sort of helped us put the protests in the late 1980s into proper historical context.
It's great that you are making this point. I think right now we are talking a lot about inflation, right? And we typically just talk about the increase in the consumer price index and blah, blah, blah percent, right? But there are some key commodities that affect people's consumption baskets tremendously. And if the prices of these commodities go up a lot, that has an enormously explosive political repercussion in all sorts of situations. So that is actually quite timely with all the supply chains, not all the supply chains, but several key supply chains being more unstable than they have been in a long time.
Fascinating. So final question of the day. This is all very helpful. I wonder if there are some other takeaways from the fascinating period of 80s. Do you think history provide any guidance on how China should conduct its own economic policies now?
Yeah, I don't think I'm in a position to give any advice to what China should be doing, but I do think that understanding the debates of the 1980s can help us cast some light on some of the tensions that kind of prevailed throughout the 90s and also 2000s in terms of different reform approaches. So the idea that basically a market economy had to be a completely private market economy versus the idea that the state could use the market as a tool towards its own larger economic goals. I think this tension basically prevailed in regards to different questions that became relevant, questions like privatization or enterprise reform, questions like international financial opening and so on, where you again and again have this question: should you just go full into the free private market, or should you proceed in an experimental fashion where the state maintains control over the essential while unleashing new market dynamics? And as these market dynamics are being unleashed, the state institutions themselves, importantly, are changing, right? Because they turn from institutions within a planned economy into market players, so that the state itself becomes one of the market players. So I think that this whole logic is a recurring one, and that in some sense, what we are seeing right now in terms of the so-called crackdown on the tech sector is an instance of a rebalancing of the relationship between the state and the market, and that we can think of the tech sector as initially being rather non-essential. I mean, obviously it's clear that it eventually will be essential, but if you think of, for example, mobile payment, when it first starts and it's just a couple of people using mobile payment because they think it's cool, then it's not essential to the working of the economy as a whole, right? But once mobile payment becomes the means of payment for pretty much anyone in China, then suddenly mobile payment is absolutely essential to the ways in which the economy is working. Similarly, with things like cryptocurrency, when initially this is just something that some tech nerds are toying around with, then it's not essential, right? But as it becomes a big sector, both in terms of production of cryptocurrency as well as increasingly in terms of facilitating transactions, then suddenly it becomes essential. And so I think that we can see these tipping points where the Chinese state is stepping in. And clearly right now we see a much larger redefinition of the relationship between the role of the state and the role of private entrepreneurs in some of these sectors that have emerged as being absolutely essential. I mean, again, with private tutoring, it's somewhat similar. Initially, if just a few people are hiring a private tutor, then this is not essential. But if it becomes essential to succeed at university, to be part of the private tutoring system, then suddenly this becomes not suddenly, it really is evolutionary process over time, but there's a tipping point where it becomes an essential part of the system, which then is being regulated in a vastly different way compared to by now many years ago.
I see. This is such a fascinating conversation. So what I will do is I will provide a link to your book in the show notes section. So our readers and audience who are interested in taking a further look at the book can, go ahead and buy the book. I'm so glad to be able to speak to you today. Thank you so much and have a good rest of the day.